Bonjour et merci d'être ici. Je suis Elizabeth May, chef de Parti vert de Canada. C'est un grand honneur pour moi de présenter un scientifique bien connu au niveau global. Dr. Gordon McBean is the former chair of the International Scientific Union. He's formerly with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Il est un professeur de l'Université de Western Ontario et le fondateur d'un centre pour les événements sévères et sinistres climatiques. It's called at University of Western Ontario, the Centre for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. Dr. McBean was its first chair and founder. He has a long and distinguished career both in Canada and internationally, most recently looking at climate science and extreme weather events. I was fortunate to know he was in town this week for a conference that has ironically been canceled due to an extreme weather event, the tornadoes in Ottawa. I've asked him here this morning, and one question I hope he will reference in the opening statement is whether there is any connection between the extreme weather events, the 3 tornadoes that touched down in Ottawa on Friday, and climate change as we now understand it. Dr. McBean.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Elizabeth. I think, well, first of all, let me say that we are seeing climate change very, very strongly now. The 2017 was the second warmest year on record. 2016 was the warmest, and 2015 was the third warmest. So we've had within these last few years the warmest 3 years on record, the 3 years where we've passed 1 degree Celsius warming globally. We should also realize that when we talk about global warming, that within Canada, we are warming more by 1.5 times, or up in the north, twice what the global average is. So these changes are happening. One of the things that we need to recognize that as we warm the system, we cause more energy within the atmosphere, within the processes, so that when you get an event like a tornado, they're driven by the energy that is within the condensing of water vapor, giving off energy. And as you warm the atmosphere, the amount of water vapor that the cloud system can hold goes up essentially exponentially with temperature. So that when that vapor goes up and then condenses to make water again, it has a huge amount of energy in it that can drive the circulation flow of a tornado. Now, tornadoes themselves are very complex. They're hard to predict in detail. We can give warnings when we know the risk, but to know it's going to be there versus there is still, unfortunately, very difficult to do. We do have Doppler weather radars that can detect them, but to say that that tornado will come down your street versus that street is as yet not something we can do. But it's just one example of the kind of extreme weather events that we know is going to happen. We've seen with Hurricane Florence happening in the Carolinas in the last bit, the predictions of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from their last global assessment was that the number of hurricanes will actually decrease with time, but not very much, but just a little bit. But the number of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes, the ones that will cause all the damage, their projection is, with a fair uncertainty, but nonetheless their projection was that a 50% increase in the number of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes. And that's because the ocean is warming, gives again more energy into the side of the system, and it's a huge system relative to a tornado. So it's more predictable in its track. We can follow it. We can say where it's going to go. But the projections are that we will see more Category 4 and 5 hurricanes, or typhoons as they're called in the Pacific Ocean. A typhoon and a hurricane are basically the same thing. It's just geography that decides whether you call it a hurricane or a typhoon. You've probably heard of the World Economic Forum. And every year, which doesn't get as much publicity as their economic projections, they put out what is called a global risk assessment. And for the last few years, they've been doing this since 2008, so they've been doing it for quite a while, and they canvass all the people and they say, what do you think is the biggest risk that will affect you, your industry, your country, in the next 10 years, only the next 10 years? And their last 2 or 3 reports, but let's just talk about the 2018 report that came out in January this year, their estimate was the event that is most likely to happen is extreme weather events, and the event that will have the second largest impact is extreme weather events. The only one they said would have more impact than extreme weather events was nuclear war. And fortunately, they rank that as relatively low likelihood. So they rank things by impact and likelihood. Unfortunately, also within that report, they also said that one of the highest impact and highest likely events that will happen in the next 10 years is failure to take action on climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. Their assessment was that the Paris Agreement is good words, but their assessment is it's not going to happen, unfortunately. So I think we need to look into these issues and say, well, how can we, for extreme weather events, reduce the impact by reducing our vulnerability and our exposure to them? When we look at it scientifically, as Elizabeth said, I'm with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, which is a Canadian-wide program that's centered at the University of Western Ontario, but we have big wind tunnel facilities, and there they've been looking at the physical structure of buildings and things and seeing how the winds blow them apart, and how could we build the structures in a way that they are less likely to be impacted by a tornado or hurricane kind of winds, or actually heavy rains. And the two together often are what creates the problem. The heavy rain will create damage that we sometimes don't see because it gets into the house, into between the walls, ends up flooding basements, but it also ends up in the walls and creates all kinds of structural failure, which we don't even notice initially until we smell it. I don't have a good smell, my wife says so, but nonetheless, the reality is that we need to work together across our governments at all levels, from local to national and internationally, and to reduce our vulnerability by making our structures better, and also to inform Canadians better. We give out weather warnings, but we need to have educational programs, support of you and the media in a way that it's communicated so that the response of people is not to go and look at out the window to see what it looks like, but to have a pre-agreed plan where you go perhaps to the basement, perhaps to your washroom, wherever, that you then find a way of where you are most protected from the fact that your building, your house, whatever you're in, might collapse, the windows blow in, be in a place that is most safe. And that is very important that these things happen, because there's huge economic and social costs. You're here in Ottawa and Montreal. In 1998 we had the ice storm. That was a horrific event. And what most people don't realize, that ice storm in 1998, which basically shut down Montreal and parts of Ottawa for a month or more, caused huge trauma on the people who lived through it, including the mothers who were expecting children. And the Montreal Neurological Research Institute did a study of those children who, when they were 6, 7, 8 years of age, who were still in their mother's womb at the time of that ice storm, and found those children were psychologically handicapped. And what we don't understand, we talk about dollar amounts of tornadoes and hurricanes, but we need to think about the socio-economic and, importantly, the health and the societal costs of these things. And we're seeing that in studies all over the world, that when you do a study a few years after, you find often it's the children, either whether they were not yet born, or in the case of Hurricane Katrina, they studied children who were already 4, 5, 6 years of age. And when they saw the trauma of that Hurricane Katrina hitting their city, New Orleans, their community, they were just traumatized. And they are affected, basically, for their life.
For you, sir, I know you alluded to it at the beginning, these tornadoes that hit Ottawa, when will we know and how will we know if there is a climate change link?
Well, we can't say with one single extreme event this was due to climate change or not, but we can say with confidence that as the climate is warming, there is more energy in the system, which will cause more extreme events. But tornadoes themselves, and particular hot days, you can't say, well, that was due to climate change. You can say, though, that as you look through the records and say that if you just look at the map of North America, where are all the tornadoes now? The biggest bands are, well, first of all, the band in Canada is from Windsor to Gatineau, and from more or less southeast Manitoba through to Edmonton, Calgary. So these two bands. But if you look over the whole continent, the bigger bands of tornadoes are in the United States, across the Kansases and Ohios and those kind of areas. And as the climate is warming, somewhat simplistic to look at it this way, but nonetheless, as the isotherms move north, then you could see the same risking of tornadoes as moving in that same sense. So it's, as we say, detailed climate models don't carry tornadoes in them because they're too small for the mathematics and the computer abilities to do them. But we can predict the risks, and as we see the risks increasing, as we get warmer, more warm days, more hot days, more moisture in the atmosphere, then you, as a scientist, we would say, yes, the risk of a tornado is going to increase. I can't say the last few days, other than it affected all kinds of people. And it's really, I've been driving around Ottawa. I arrived on Sunday and picked up my granddaughter at her house near Carleton. And there were, all down the street where she's staying with other students, there were trees down all over the place. And she had no electric power at her house. I think, as I understand, there are 4 people in the hospital. We had in Pine Lake, Alberta in 2000, a really tragic tornado that killed 12 people. It hit a mobile home park. And again, there are people who are more vulnerable because they're exposed in mobile homes. And the real tragedy, all 12 are a tragedy, but one of them was a small baby whose mother was running, holding the baby, trying to find someplace safe to go, and the wind tore it away. It was a boy, as I recall. I went and visited the site and wrote some papers on it after the incident. And when we went back some years later, there was no change. There was still mobile homes all over the place, but no place to go for safety. And we need to do that. I don't know what it's like now. This is a long time ago, but we need to have safe places to go where people are in these exposed things, and better warning systems. So not just if people happen to be watching television at the right time. We can, and we do have in various places now with more cellular phones and things, people can sign up for warning systems, and we need to work with that, and the Weather Service is doing those kind of things now. So it's getting better, but we still need some further steps in view of the increased risks. Thank you.
Well, thanks. I just want to thank you for attending, and thank you for your questions. And I also particularly want to thank Dr. McBean. The work of climate science is sometimes I think it's a miracle that we have scientists who are able to communicate well to the public. Of all the climate scientists I know, I think Dr. McBean is one of the clearest communicators, because scientists are dealing with, as you said, it's complicated. You want to talk about isothermic bands, or you want to talk about hot airs moving. One way or another, I'm very grateful that Dr. McBean has continued to try to educate people. I speak about climate science in the House. I recently raised the most recent study that I think is terrifying, is the news that the Gulf of St. Lawrence is deoxygenating, and that we may lose all life, marine life, in one of Canada's richest marine ecosystems in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So the impacts of climate change as we see them are unpredictable and full of surprises. So we can say, as the scientists have been warning us from the IPCC from some time, we're going to see sea level rise. We're going to see the Great Lakes water levels dropping. We're going to see more extreme weather events. We're going to see more forest fires. These are the things that have been predicted for a long time. Losing the oxygen in the Gulf of St. Lawrence wasn't something I saw coming. And I certainly had never thought about tornadoes coming through Ottawa. But these are things that we're experiencing now because we are in a climate emergency, and we need to take much more meaningful action. So I thank you all for coming this morning.
I just say quickly, I was in Beijing last week for the World Conference on Science Literacy, and they brought together 1,500 scientists from all over the world. We put out a declaration because this idea that we have to help people all over the world, developed countries, developing countries, better understand, be more up to date in science. And part of it relies on scientists being able to communicate. And people like you in the media being able to, as you do, but even more so, communicate the science in ways that people read it, understand it, so they will take the right actions when on climate change, on disaster risk reduction, sustainable development, and all the other goals which we have set for ourselves as a society. But it's going to be tough to achieve them unless we start taking action. Thank you.
Good, thanks.